Thanks, Leo. It was a nice introduction. Yeah, I hope I can meet this criteria as said by you. So that will do my best. Well, thank you very much. Well, yeah, this challenging question. How do you design for a social ecological city? Of course, I think today there will be some very interesting clues to open the debate on this topic. And I think, yeah, in the end of the day, we won't have the final answer to it. But it would be very important to discuss these issues, and especially from a design perspective. So I think today we will see some interesting approaches from academia developed here in Delft and in other places, but also some practical, let's say, applications of that. And I think the interrelation between the academic community and practice is really important, and therefore I'm very happy to participate in this endeavor. Yeah, actually, when I think about designing for a social, ecological, inclusive city, then I think about nature, people, and landscape. And I will elaborate on briefly what I mean by that. And when I, just to clarify, when I use the word landscape, it is not, let's say, it's actually the world which starts outside the building. So the urban environment is also part of the urban landscape, you can say. So it's more like a continuum. So it's not because I wear a green coat that I use the word landscape. I think it's the landscape as we see it around us is the result of the action and interaction of humans with the natural environment. So that's really like the kind of fundamental stance. So when we talk about nature, then you see a couple of formative elements in there, which we might use as a designer or as a planner, which is about water, soil, relief, but also the ecosystems and the biotopes connected to it, ecological succession, and also the flora and fauna connected to it. So in a way, it's like a kind of systemic view, or world view, you can say, how things relate to each other. So when you have a certain soil topology, you also know what kind of ecosystem can be connected to it, the hydrological regime connected to it. And these are really powerful formative powers, you can say, which we might use as a designer in that regard. Also, from a people's perspective, you also have formative powers, such as livability, human scale, urban climate, etc. But also safety, demographics, politics, interactions, accessibility, economy. So we all know that this is really important. And usually this is also like a perspective people can have towards urban design. And in the end, this results in this urban landscape, cities we were talking about. But when we talk about landscape, it's also about the spatial organization and patterns involved. And I referred to types already. So we have more like urban typologies, we have natural typologies. It's really interesting to delve into that and how these things are related to each other. Then we can also look at form and process. So sometimes processes have a very strong formative power. And that means that we can study forms in order to understand processes. So also the other way around. So when we look to the resulting forms of all of these processes, it will be a window to understand also how these things are working. And of course, there's also this functional view of living, industry, agriculture, etc., etc. It's also an important element. And then, of course, we also have the context. So depending on where you are in the world, it makes a big difference when you are in Europe or in Asia, for instance. Climate, but also different skill levels. So actually what we try to do here in Delft is to appropriate a multi-scale design approach, where the local scale is connected to the regional and vice versa. So when you develop a strategy, a long-term strategy on a regional scale, it also means something on the local scale and vice versa. And that's very interesting. And I think this afternoon we will see some nice examples of that. So having said, let's say, outline these basic denominators to this debate, you can also say, okay, you can translate that into design approaches. And in the world around us, you see very interesting design methods, taking, let's say, these basic denominators as the basis. For instance, nature-based design approaches. So you know biophilic design, I'm sure you have heard of it, or ecological urbanism. So these are, let's say, design approaches which really take natural processes as the basis of their design. For instance, also water-sensitive design is also part of this. And these are very valuable ways to get a grip on these natural processes and to work with that. On the other hand, you see also people-based design approaches, which take inclusive urban design as the basis. So how do people move through an urban space? And how can you organize it in such a way that you initiate interaction at all kinds of levels? Also design at eye level. So perceptual aspects are very important in that regard. So how do people perceive their environment and how can you work with these mechanisms? And in the end, you also have landscape-based design approaches, which are more about the system as a whole. Also looking at different scale levels, but also designing with social and ecological processes. And I think also today we will see some of these examples displayed in the lectures by our lecturers. But then, of course, at the heart is this idea of design. So at our Department of Urbanism, design is really at the core of what we do. So then the question is, what makes us special in that regard? And I think it's really about the relation between, on the one hand, research, and on the other hand, design. So these are two worlds which are strongly interconnected. Also, the challenges connected to developing social and ecological inclusive cities require an interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary way of working. And then the question is, how can the design be instrumental in that process? It's also very interesting. But also this multi-scale element, from the backyard to the region and vice versa. So whatever you do, you can start at the local scale, but then you also need to take into account the regional perspective, the long-term perspective, you can say. Where are you working towards? But on the other hand, also, what are we going to do tomorrow? And how can we involve the local people in that? Then what's really interesting is that design is in this regard an integrative practice. So different disciplines work together and other stakeholders, but also when you put things on paper, also all kinds of disciplinary knowledge comes together. So you need to know something about water, ecology, but also how people behave, economics, technical features. All these things come together in the design process. And when you are aware of it, you can also make use of that by organizing processes in such a way that you connect all of these elements together. So in a way, you could say in the landscape, in the urban landscape, everything comes together. And that might also put a big responsibility to spatial planners and designers, because then they also are a key player in addressing these issues in a more integral way. And that requires from designers that they are not only specialists, but also generalists. So in that word, it's always like a dilemma, you can say. Is it really deepening out some aspects, or is it also about the overview? And of course, there are some nuances to it, but in practice, usually you see that landscape architects, urban planners, urban designers are very, let's say, useful in that regard. Also, I mentioned this idea of moving from disciplinary to trans and interdisciplinary. Also here at the university, we have many scholars focusing on specific fields and deepening them out. But we also strongly believe that connecting these fields is of utmost importance in a practical context. In that regard, we really can make a difference. And also in that regard, designers can play a very powerful role. So we also strive in our department not to organize only this disciplinary development, but also this interdisciplinarity. And therefore, I'm very happy that we have this afternoon display this interdisciplinarity. Then, of course, also related to design, as it is a forward-looking, action, it's very interesting that there are different ways to cope with uncertainty related to looking into the future. We don't have something like a glazed wall or something else. So actually we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or this afternoon. But then we have powerful tools in our hands to deal with that uncertainty and to move forward anyway. And when you look, let's say, to all kinds of approaches, you see roughly actually 3 types of approaches. More top-down oriented prediction approaches using computer models, for instance, data as a means to get a grip on how it functions now, but also how it can function in the future by extrapolation techniques. Really helpful, for instance, developing climate scenarios or urban heat effect, and also helping you to get a grip on what the effect of urban green on the urban climate will be, etc., etc. So really sophisticated models are we have available in that regard. On the other end of the spectrum, we see more bottom-up approaches, where it's really about developing a kind of resilience in order to cope with changing circumstances. So it's more about developing design principles, making people aware and helping them to make wise choices in that regard. And of course, there's also methods to combine these two parts. And of course, these more robust approaches are close to my heart, I can tell you, because then you can also talk about, for instance, knowledge-based design. So making use of these different facilities can be very useful. And therefore, I would like to spend my last couple of minutes in this lecture on the landscape as an approach, because I think taking the landscape as a basis for addressing the challenges we have to deal with nowadays, and to come up with social-ecological inclusive cities, is very powerful to take the overall as a basis. And that requires, and there are a couple of characteristics connected to it. It's certainly not blueprint planning. So it's not about, okay, we make a regional plan or a city plan and we just execute it according to that. No, it's a multi-scale design approach, which works with the logic of the landscape. And later I'm going to elaborate a little bit on what I mean by that. But also working with adaptive design principles. And it's a little bit, principles is always a very difficult, how to say, term. Because what do you mean by that? And I always compare it with making a movie. We have thousands of movies, but actually there are only a few ways to make a movie. So do you know these ways on how to make a movie? Because when you know them, then you can make your own. And that's of course also in the spatial environment. There are some, let's say, principles behind which really work and which you can make use of in the design approach. Also, this landscape-based approach entails the best of both worlds. So you need to get to know the natural environment you are working in. But on the other hand, you also need to work with the people, different expertises, stakeholders, people living there. So therefore, you can say there are 4 steps. There's a diagnosis. So really understanding the area you are working on at different skill levels. Then based on this understanding, you start to develop a strategy, a long-term perspective, and then you reason backwards on what kind of design principles you can make use of and what strategic projects you can start working with. And in the end, it's also about action perspectives. So it's not only making nice plans, but also putting them to work. And all of this circles around this idea of research and design, transdisciplinarity, and visualization. So I strongly believe when you go through this cycle with all the stakeholders, co-creating knowledge and ideas, you really can make a change. So it's really about this, starting to get to know each other's language. So when a civil engineer, for instance, talks about design, it's a real different design as when you talk about as a landscape architect, for instance. And it's good to get on the same page in that. But at the same time, we can also start to explore possibilities by designing, putting pen and paper to action, you can say. Because usually when you have a map or a drawing on the table, then you can get a real discussion. Because usually on the general level, you can agree or disagree, but in the end of the day, the problem starts on a local scale when things become physical and concrete. And therefore drawings and mappings and visualizations are so important. not only as a way to visualize what you read, but also to get on the same page. So it's a really important element in this transdisciplinary thinking. And of course, it's also providing perspectives and ideas through visualization. And of course, in that regard, we can also utilize the new technologies we have at hand. And this is, for instance, a point cloud, like a one-to-one copy of a Chinese garden. And of course, we could give a whole afternoon lecture on all the possibilities the digital realm gives us. But these are really powerful tools we can make use of in understanding the landscape at different skill levels where we work with. Okay, then the first step, understanding the landscape logic. And that's really about understanding the landscape as a system. And when you talk about systems, on one hand, you always talk about structures and processes. It's really about different skill levels. It's like the armature of a lighter. So when you don't have the armature, you don't have light. But when you don't have the electricity network, it doesn't work either. Right? And that's the same with water in the city, for instance, or with transportation, etc., etc. So it's really about understanding the different dynamics and how they are related to each other. And here in Delft, we developed a couple of methods in order to get a grip on this complexity by certain layer approaches, organizing the landscape in layers according to the dynamic of development. It's also about working through the scale in terms of position. Where is it located? So when you talk about a delta environment, it's really different from, for instance, working in the uplands, in the sandy higher grounds, for instance, because it delivers different conditions on a local scale level, hydrological regimes, for instance. So now in the east of the Netherlands, we suffer from drought. Who thought about that? In the Netherlands, this water country, we suffer from drought. Really strange. It has something to do with these conditions on a local scale level. So you really need to get aware of that, work with that. Because then in the end of the day, you could translate it in more operational features. How to translate it into public space structures, for instance. How to work with the circumstances. And then, of course, you can start to develop regional strategies, just regional designs, which provide a kind of direction where you can work to. And this is like one of the regional designs we made for the Pearl River Delta, which is about half the size of the Netherlands. And this map is a product of 5 years of intense collaboration with different stakeholders. And it is not a blueprint plan, it provides a kind of direction for long-term development. And it is systemic, integral, multi-layered in many degrees. So the legend, you can say, is really connected to this idea of how can we make the system work? And how can we provide conditions for future development? So not determining how things should be, but providing conditions that things could develop or facilitate certain developments. It's like gardening on a regional scale. We cultivate the grounds in such a way that the garden will thrive, or economy will thrive, or urban development will thrive. So we also started to develop some adaptive principles, which we learned from many case studies. And this is only a few of them, and I'm sure you know many more of them. But what's really interesting, then you can start applying them in certain situations. Then it becomes really like a kind of way of how to explore the possibilities of the application of these principles in a certain context. So it means you have a range of different possibilities on how to translate them into space. And this is one of the examples of a Chinese city, which we developed together with the Oka landscape architects, which is now really in the execution phase. And it's also about connecting nature with heritage, with urban development. And then, of course, we could try to evaluate and learn from that in that regard. So, to end up my speech, how do you design for a social inclusive city? Of course, there's no definitive answer to that. But I think nature, people, and the landscape should be considered as a design approach. And of course, how more integral it is, how better it is in that regard. So in that way, design can also become like an integrated practice throughout the skills, also as an exploratory tool to explore the potential of certain principles and to learn from each other at different skill levels. It's really also about understanding and designing with this social and natural systems where we are working with. Really thorough analysis of that and build on that for future development. And in that regard, it is really crucial to work in trans and interdisciplinary ways. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Steffen. Before we please keep your think about questions, we will have time for discussion and answering of questions after the first third. The first three speakers have been here, but Steffen, before we continue, one question. Transdisciplinary, multidisciplinarity, and disciplinarity. But one question. In education, what should be the balance in your view on disciplinary rigor? Like we need to teach people the basics of urban design or landscape architecture design, and we have only 2 years to achieve that. So we need all that time for disciplinary knowledge. And your appeal is for interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity. How can you say it requires that you already have a disciplinary basis? How would you balance that in education or in practice?
That's a very valid question. Thank you, Leo. But I think that the great thing is that landscape architects, urban planners, and urban designers are integrators by nature. So in that way, you can say the disciplines, as mentioned, are focused on integrating knowledge in that regard. So I think that will, so I strongly believe when you would like to become a good landscape architect or urban designer, you also need to know, let's say, the backgrounds of your discipline. I completely agree. But on the other hand, you also need to see that these disciplines are in a way already integrating many elements. So implicitly it is there. But I think by making it more explicit in, let's say, the design projects we work on, that urban designers and planners and landscape architects come together, I think will strengthen this idea. Okay.